If you've been diagnosed with hypothyroidism and you're eating clean, you've removed gluten, you've removed dairy, you've been taking your supplements, you've even used medication, and you still feel tired, then no one has probably asked you this. Are you eating enough protein to build thyroid hormone in the first place? Because thyroid hormone is not made out of thin air. It's built, and building requires material. Here's what I see over and over again. Low thyroid markers, for example, low T4, sometimes maybe even a low T3, and right next to it on the lab panel are multiple indicators of low protein intake. Yeah, maybe that looks like a low total protein. It could look like a low globulin, low normal bun, low alkaline phosphatase. There's all these subtle indicators, these signs that we're getting feedback that say low protein that are being overlooked. And they tell a story, and it's interesting to me that many times when I dig deeper into the diet of individuals that I see these patterns with, they tend to be eating light. And so what I mean by that is that maybe they're doing smoothies and salads and snacks here and there. They're fueling up with coffee when they need to push through. But what's missing? Enough complete protein. That's what I don't see. And especially not enough high quality animal protein. The effort's high. I have to commend it, but the fuel, the building materials, they're low. So in that scenario, the question becomes, could inadequate protein intake be suppressing thyroid output? Hypothyroidism is often treated as a hormone issue in isolation. But thyroid hormone production, it has multiple requirements. For example, you need tyrosine. Tyrosine is an amino acid. You need adequate overall protein intake, not just to supply tyrosine, but to supply other amino acids that are relevant in thyroid hormone production also. You need proper liver conversion, meaning you need to be able to convert T4 to T3, and that also happens in the kidney and in the gut. And about the gut, you need good gut integrity because many cases of hypothyroidism are hashimotos. They're autoimmune driven. So this is a conversation today not about replacing medication. That's not the point here. We're not trying to subvert a medication. This is simply about asking whether or not the body has the raw materials to be able to build thyroid hormone. Let's keep this straightforward today. Your thyroid hormone, specifically T4, the main hormone that is produced from the gland, is synthesized from tyrosine and from iodine. Tyrosine is an amino acid. Amino acids come from protein. There is not going to be adequate thyroid hormone production when you have an insufficiency of amino acid availability. And this is not a controversial topic. This is just basic biochemistry and physiology that we're talking about today. But you need tyrosine incorporation into a protein called thyroglobulin to ultimately be able to build T4. So you need the tyrosine, but you also need the proteins to build the thyroglobulin, which is itself a protein, right? And so if the intake of protein is chronically low, it just simply means that your substrate availability to make these components that we're talking about, it's going to be low as well. And what does your body tend to do when there is a scarcity of resources? It conserves, it hangs on to what it has, which means that your metabolism is going to slow down. If there's not adequate components to make thyroid hormone, the natural response from the body is slow things back down and hang on to what availability we do have. This is not overt dysfunction. This is just an adaptation response from the body based on the input that it's being given. Now, some of you may say, well, yeah, but I have autoimmune hypothyroidism. I have Hashimoto's. Well, you should be listening twice as hard to what I'm saying here because this applies to you even more so because autoimmune states increase protein demand. Now, let's let's look at how this actually plays out, because autoimmunity is not a passive process. In fact, autoimmunity is a very metabolically taxing, a very metabolically expensive process. So when your immune system is trying to signal different responses, many of those responses require amino acids to be completed. In addition to that, when you look at things like antibodies, which are going to be the proteins that the immune system uses to respond to a threat, antibody production, that also requires adequate amino acids. The tissue repair that comes from the inflammatory responses that are an inherent byproduct of autoimmunity, that tissue repair, it's going to require amino acids. And you can't get away in this conversation of autoimmunity without talking about the gut. If there's gut hyperpermeability, which there has to be, just because by definition that is part of autoimmunity, then that is also a repair process, and that intestinal lining structurally requires adequate protein to be able to rebuild. And remember, the inherent rebuild rate for your gut, assuming no problems, is every 3 to 7 days. And we're talking about a state of dysfunction that is likely accelerating that. So whether you're talking about the tight junctions that keep those cells together, whether you're talking about the basement membrane and the collagen requirement to make the basement membrane in the gut, or even just directly supplying the cells that make up the gut lining, you don't need less protein in autoimmunity. You need more protein. And the more healing that you have to do, the greater your requirement for protein is going to be. And it's worth noting that there's a strong association in the literature between autoimmune thyroid and increased intestinal permeability and microbiome imbalance. And even when you start looking at using proteins help produce what are called branch chain fatty acids. Not short chain fatty acids, but branch chain fatty acids. Those are protein derived, and those also feed the microbiota. So point being here, if you've got an autoimmune scenario, you have a high protein demand and you've got to feed that. You've probably heard about the gut-brain axis, the connection between the gut and the brain. That's just one of many axes in the body, one of many connections to the gut. Almost every system or tissue in the body has a connection to your gut. Why would the thyroid be any different? It's not. There is literally what's called the gut-thyroid axis. And many people are simply, when they approach the thyroid from a non-pharmaceutical model, they're just looking at what supplements can I throw at it, generically attacking that, if you will. You do have to pay attention to things like selenium, zinc, iodine, iron comes into this conversation because they do matter. They all do support in building thyroid hormone and making the conversions for thyroid hormone. But if your gut is inflamed or permeable, then the absorption on those nutrients is not going to be as optimal as what it should be. And if dietary protein is inadequate, you're attempting to repair without these minerals. It's like trying to build a house without having the basic boards, the two-by-fours, and the other structures that you need, the sheetrock, to actually frame the house out and build the rooms and make it what we all think about as a home. You just can't build what you envision if you don't have the raw materials to be able to actually accomplish that. And the same thing is true biologically. If you don't have the base raw materials, you're not going to build the thyroid hormone that you're looking for. Now, since I'm on this topic of protein, I really can't have this conversation with you without delving into the quality of the protein. And that's where this whole conversation really, I'm going to bring it back home to you here now. And understand that not all protein is created equal. Complete proteins are important in this conversation, and I would advise that those be especially consumed from your pasture-raised animals. So, for example, pasture-raised chicken, your grass-fed and finished beef and other ruminant animals, because those are going to provide all of the essential amino acids. That's the reason the completeness and the animal part of this is so important. In addition, and here's where the animal part becomes relevant, is that you're also getting highly bioavailable sources of iron and zinc. And in addition, you're getting selenium, B12, vitamin A. These are all nutrients that are going to support thyroid hormone production and the conversion from your T4 to your T3. So from your inactive to your active form of thyroid hormone. But that's not where they end. Remember, you need these proteins for immune regulation. And when you're looking at differentiating the quality of the protein here and you're comparing an animal that's raised on pasture with its normal or natural dietary habits, it's allowed to graze like it should and finish out on grass, or birds that are finished out on pasture, that's much different than what you see from an animal that's in a feedlot scenario. And we literally know now that the profiles of the nutrients in that meat product differ. There's a higher amount of omega-3s. You're going to have more micronutrient density in these foods. You're going to have more secondary health promoting metabolites. You're going to have the absence of these chemicals like glyphosate and dicamba and atrazine, all these toxic compounds that are used as herbicides and pesticides that continue to reside in the food supply that ultimately build up and have been shown to create negative health outcomes. You're not consuming those things. So you take the toxic element out of the conversation. And that is a system that is building more resiliency in your body. Now, as it relates to the high quality protein, I'm not just suggesting that you just consume more massive amounts of meat. That's not where I'm trying to take you here. This is really about consistently eating enough complete protein that is actually going to be a source of nourishment and provide the nutrients that you need to optimize your thyroid health. I want you to make sure you don't overlook what I'm getting ready to say. I am not suggesting that this simply means that hypothyroidism is just a protein deficiency. That's not what I'm trying to suggest to you here. What I am telling you is that if there's inadequate protein intake, that can suppress thyroid hormone output. Your body may not be broken. Your thyroid may be completely fine. It may just be in more of a conservation mode because you're not giving it the substrates that it needs to be able to carry out the work that it is supposed to do. And as a byproduct, it's slowed your metabolism down. Understand that that is an intelligent design. That is not a failure of your body. It is your body trying to operate under the physiology that it was designed to operate under. Now, before you assume your thyroid is failing, go ahead and ask the question, am I consistently eating enough protein, enough complete protein that it's going to support my thyroid hormone production? Because you can't make these hormones without the building blocks. If this video has shifted your way of thinking about hypothyroidism, if you want to know if you're low in protein, well, go ahead and watch the video on the screen. I'll show you a couple of lab markers to know for sure that even your doctor's not going to tell you about to assess whether or not you have low protein.